Okay, welcome everyone to Mountaineer Farm Talk. My name is J.J. Barrett, Extension Agent from Wood County for Agriculture. Also have with me John David Johnson. What's up, JD?
Oh, just hanging in here. Excited to talk a little bit about fall seedings and some of the good forages we got coming up about this time of year.
Yep, forages today. Evan, how are you doing, my friend?
Oh, good. Hope to learn something here new today and maybe apply to our operation.
Good. Well, we want to welcome everyone and glad that you're listening to Mountaineer Farm Talk. Like I said, join us every Friday at 10 a.m. We'll learn, laugh, share, and enjoy a cup of cowboy coffee or herbal tea. We encourage audience participation, so have your questions ready. Today we have two special guests. First, I want to introduce Alan Galler from Sandusky County, Ohio. He's the agriculture extension educator up there. Morning, Alan.
Good morning.
How you doing today?
Doing well.
Good. Are you ready to talk forages?
I sure am.
Alan, of course, has the in his backyard the North Central Ag Research Center there near Fremont, up there in vegetable production country in Ohio. But he does a lot of forage research. He's extensively done some work in using oats for forage for livestock. Also, we have our own Ben Goff from Mason County. Ben, what's up today?
Oh, surviving, waiting to see what I can learn from Alan too. So,
well, we're all, of course, Ben is does a lot of our grazing schools around the Mountain State with extension, and he, of course, has a background and forages, and he's going to be talking about doing some seedings, and maybe we might even talk a bit about cover crops. So let's go to Alan first, I guess. Can you tell us a little bit about some of your research you've done with oats as far as for forage for livestock, and how that came about and the importance of that for some of our cattle producers?
Well, it first came about way back in another life 20 years ago when I first started my career in extension. I was in central Ohio in Fairfield County, just to the southeast of Columbus. Had a really awesome support staff team there in the county, including Soil and Water and NRCS. We all had a great working relationship. And I started that year. My first job out of college as the extension educator there in Fairfield County, I started end of July or 1st of August, and we were in the middle of one of the most severe droughts we'd had there since about 1988. And pretty diverse county, a lot of row crop farming, but also hits right at the edge of Appalachia there, and a bunch of beef cattle in that county. And there were farmers just worried sick about how we can't even get through the rest of this summer. What are we going to feed these cows this winter? Because there is nothing green anywhere. Corn yields were expected to be extremely low, so silage was not going to pan out. And we were just all sitting around putting our heads together, and had gotten some information from Heart of America grazing conferences, which we had several of those guys had attended, and looked at some of the work that, and his name is slipping me now, Ed something from out in Illinois, that had been doing a bunch of work on trying to figure out how you could, in the middle of row crop country, raise cattle and be successful at it. And the goal was to try to graze those cattle 365 days out of the year without feeding any stored feeds. And part of that plan was with their crop rotation of corn, soybeans, and wheat, utilizing that ground anytime that one of those crops was not on it. Part of that plan was growing annuals in the late summer, early fall after wheat. And so we had remembered some conversations from that previous grazing conference, and we started going out around the county telling guys to pull some feed oats out and go throw them in the ground, and let's see if we can't make some feed for these cows. And lo and behold, we stumbled onto some pretty good success in that first year. Even in that dry of a year, dropped a bunch of oats in the ground the first 2 weeks of August, and experienced yields anywhere from 1 ton to up to over 3 tons per acre of dry matter in a matter of 60 to 90 days. And so that just snowballed right there. Being the young, impressionable educator I was at that time, looking for something to hang my hat on, I said, we got some research to do here. So we launched into research projects, figuring out when is the best time to plant these things, how heavy should we be planting them, how much nitrogen do they require, how are we going to harvest them, what is the best way to harvest them to utilize the take advantage of the best feed quality, and just any angle you could throw at it. We've been working on it for the last 20 years.
Okay, well, how much, if we are going to say that I've got 5 to 10 acres, how heavy should I plant these oats?
What we found is typically somewhere between 80 and 100 pounds, and that varies. It's real similar to what we'd expect with, I know you guys don't probably have a lot of wheat growers down there, but what we talk about here with wheat, the ideal planting window, once you get past that ideal planting window, you just need to continually increase the amount of pounds that you're going to seed. But if you can plant somewhere between that July 25th and August 10th range, we're shooting for 80 to 90 pounds of seed per acre. One of the variables in that, however, is your source of oats that you're going to plant. For the most part, with these research projects, we've taken the old farmer approach. We're not going to call up and order certified treated seed. We want to do it as cheaply and easily as possible. So we just went to the feed bin and started grabbing oats out of there and put them in the ground. And depending on your source of oats, if you grow them locally, you guys probably know this too, you're going to have significantly different cleanliness of that seed as well as test weight. Most of our oats at all the feed mills around here, even throughout Ohio, are Canadian sourced oats that are going to be much heavier test weight than our typically locally grown ones. So depending on how clean they are, where they came from, you might vary that seeding rate a little bit on the poundage in order to get proper seed count. We have not gotten into the fine nuts and bolts of looking at actual seed count, because obviously we're planting these with a drill, and in some cases we're flying them onto standing soybeans as well. Drilled in 80 to 90 pounds. We get into mid-August, early September. We need to push that all the way up to as possibly as high as 120 pounds per acre.
Okay. Ben, speaking of that, I have a question about what's your opinion on the difference between broadcasting and drilling. I know that a lot of old school farmers still like to broadcast, but then if we use a drill, you get a lot more precise. You may not get the coverage you want, but you get more precise seedings. What's your opinion on that?
I think a lot of it comes down to the logistics of the operation. I don't necessarily think one's better than the other. I mean, the nice thing about a drill is that you get the proper placement, the depth. You get good soil seed contact when you once you're done with it. The downside of that is not everybody has a drill. I know, especially in West Virginia, there's a big issue with availability, and I know a lot of people a lot of conservation districts do have some. A lot of times there's a route, and sometimes it's just being able to haul that drill to where you're going. I'm becoming more and more of a fan of just broadcasting it, truthfully. I mean, I think there's a lot of things you can do to get good soil to seed contact. You might like this, break that sod up if you're going into a new seeding, dragging it if it's prepared seed bed. You're with a roller or a harrow turn upside down, or even just chain link fence works good. It doesn't take much to cover those depths. A lot of times with a drill, people aren't used to them. They have a tendency to put them in too deep. More with oats and some of the grain crops and cover crops, you can go a little bit deeper. But most foliar species, you're looking at about 1/4 of an inch or shallower. So I mean, that's really hard to kind of be able to set that drill. Plus, the other thing I'm starting to notice too is that when you do use a drill, you get this nice perfect row, and there's a lot of big gap in between there. It takes a little bit of time to fill it out. So that's why I kind of like being able to do broadcast. But really, it's either or. I think the main thing is trying to reseeding it if you do reseed it. But a lot of times it's just kind of a trade-off between what works in that operation.
And I think a big thing is where you're putting it into. What kind of operation is it? A sod based? Is it is it going to kind of go into a cover crop, which is then going to be grazed after that? Different parts of the country, where I grew up, we done a lot of oats, rye, and wheat mixture in that winter in South Georgia, because you get down that coastal plain area, you're getting your crops out of there, your peanuts, your cotton, whatever. You're kind of ripping that ground up a little bit. And what we do is we do both drilling and broadcasting. But if you broadcast, we always go back over it with a little bit of a field cultivator just to throw a little bit of soil back on there, because that soil to seed contact that Ben was talking about is really important, because water, heat, and soil contact is the ingredients for germination. And to get that good soil contact is very important. So if you are broadcasting, you can't just broadcast out there for those who hasn't done this before and just leave it and expect to get a good stand. You do have to go back over it to get that good seed contact. And even if you have something that can throw a little dirt over it, but like something like a quarter packer on the back that kind of presses it down, would even be a little better. I've done some broadcasting, and the quarter packer broke down one year, and it was test plots, and me and Rodney Walbrown was out in Mason County by McCausland, and so we took our trucks and run back and forth over those test plots. It took us till about dark, and we about run out of gas, but that was the best turnout of germination that I've had to get that, it pressed that soil so down on that seed. So make sure whatever you do, if you're drilling it in or broadcasting it and then going back over it, make sure you get good to seed to soil contact.
So,
JD,
some of the best stands I've ever seen of clover is actually a brilliant seeder, and it's just like John David. It basically broadcasts it, just drops it, and it has the roller on the back, and it just packs it in, pressing it. The other thing that y'all mentioned too, that seeding rates need to be higher in broadcasting. Usually what you call your extension office to give you a recommendation, that's kind of a theoretical number. I would say probably increase at 25-30% if you're going to do broadcasting, because you're not going to be able to cover all the seed up, and you'll be birds picking through it or various other things that seed is lost. So I think it's the downside of broadcasting too. You might have to increase the seed rate just a little bit, but in terms of dollars, it's usually just a few extra dollars more, if that, per acre.
That's a good point, Ben. JD,
With that, if I can add there to what Ben said, it wouldn't be, or it would be very beneficial too, especially in the case of a lot of these where we're using bin run oats, to send those off and get a germination test done. We found out just this year, a lot of our feed, even our triple cleaned Canadian feed source oats, germination was extremely low this year. Nothing like we've ever seen before. We didn't test them. A lot of guys didn't test them. So now that we've seen the results, that we're 2 months into this year's research projects, we've started doing some germ tests, and it's 10% lower than we normally see.
Yeah, a good point, Alan. And you can also do a germ test at home too, really.
Absolutely.
A lot of times we'll just take like a Ziploc container and put like a wet paper towel, damp paper towel. You don't want a lot of free water in it, and just count out, I would say probably at least 20 to 30 seeds. Drop them in there, put another wet paper towel on top of them, and just let them set. And a lot of times that gives you a good idea, or you can sum out like Alan said.
And when you're doing that, let the people around you know you're doing that, because I was doing some germination tests one time, and it kept getting thrown away. My wife kept coming down there and throwing it away because there's a wet paper towel with seeds in it. It took me 5 times of doing it to get the results.
hey, I guess this may be a question both for Ben and Alan about would it be worth it for, as far as planting the oats, to buy either certified or even some of these everleaf varieties that are more for geared up for forages? Would it be worth planting that for this, to spend the extra money for improved varieties?
For most cases, we've found that it's probably not, but that's probably one loophole in our research, is we haven't spent a whole lot of time. I've played with it a lot on my own farm, using some of the mixes with the everleaf oats and peas and triticale and some other stuff in them. For the most part, if we're looking at trying to make beef cow feed, what we're looking at is, are we meeting the nutrient requirements of those animals? And can we do it with the least cost scenario of taking those oats out of our feed bin? And in most cases with beef cows, that answer is yes, even lactating beef cows. Now, if we're going to try to make dairy quality feed, maybe even in some cases a little bit higher demand on certain areas for sheep production, may have some benefit, because those everleaf are going to grow longer into the season. Most times we're going to notice that those bin run oats are going to try to make a seed head. They won't put a seed in it, but we all know what happens to our grasses in May and June when they start pushing that seed head out, and what the feed quality does. Same thing this time of year with these oats. So if we can find a variety that is not going to make a seed head until 90 days after planting rather than 60 days, we can definitely keep that protein up, keep that digestibility up, have a higher quality product. What we need to do though is, just like our hay samples all summer, we need to be testing that forage and figure out exactly what is in it to know long-term whether that's going to pan out. And like I said, in most cases, those bin run oats are going to give us a high enough quality feed for our beef cows.
Yeah, and I mean, that's all great points, and I'll back up to, a lot of times it's an economic consideration. I mean, you're looking at, now on something like this where it's a short season crop and you're just looking for a little bit extra benefit, you think about, you're probably not, and I have no research to back this up, but paying 25-30 cents a pound, if it came off your own farm, not even that, you really can't go buy a feed wheat and plant it. But like, it's economic consideration too. You have that there versus going to pay $2-3 a pound to seed it. Now on other forages, like let's say perennials, I think you're probably better off to plant an improved variety. And the reason why that is, a lot of times we have a bad issue. A convenient variety is not always a profitable variety, is what I say. Because a lot of times it says red clover, you know nothing about that other than the fact that it's red clover. They call it VNS, variety not stated. What I always tell my growers, it's like a corn producer. They're not going to go to Tractor Supply and get a bag that says corn and go plant for field corn. I have had that happen. But you usually pay what you're getting for. So like on a short season annual, like Alan's talking about, I think that's fine. But on perennials, I think it's really in your best benefit to get improved variety, because you know what you're getting. There's a kind of a pedigree to it. You know that this is a certain variety. It's been bred to be higher yielding, and in some cases higher nutrition. So I think, for perennials and stuff like that. Now feed oats and stuff like that, I think I agree with Alan. You're going to get the same level of nutrition, pretty much same production, as long as you get a stand, and it's probably not worth the investment.
Well, talking about economics, let's look at the different scenarios we can look at here. What do y'all think about the, putting them in for grazing, solid stands versus put them in established annuals, pastures versus maybe solid stands that you cut for silage bales? I mean, there's different scenarios that are, baleage bales. There's different scenarios. What is the economics you have seen kind of over those different scenarios there? Do you get my question?
I do. A lot of that in our part of the world, and I suppose it would have the same effect down there. It depends on, just like we're talking about, the availability of the drill. It depends on your operation. Where I'm at in Northwest Ohio, in flat as a board row crop country, we don't have very many fences, and we don't have very extravagant water systems. So that pasture you see in my background picture is about 13 acres of river bottom, and that's about half of the pasture in this county right there. Flat row crop ground. So we do have some temporary fencing situations where we can put up and graze, but for the most part, we are harvesting these forages. And one of the things that I learned from all those great folks back in Fairfield County is that the cheapest cutter bar to run on your operation is only 3 inches wide. And that economic impact right there is huge. If we can harvest those forages with some step-in posts and a hot wire, we are saving ourselves tons and tons of money. I didn't put together a bunch of data that I can share my screen on hard numbers for you, but just in the instance of, my family does some custom large square baling around, $5 to $6 to $7 an acre to rake and set that stuff, $15 an acre to mow it, $10 a bale to bale it, another $10 a bale to wrap it, and we're talking big squares. That money adds up pretty quickly. But in my scenario here with no pasture and no fences, that still beats the heck out of buying $250 a ton alfalfa or other feedstuffs, or trying to grow corn silage that we don't have equipment for. So it all depends on the individual farm scenario, what equipment is available, and how can I harvest these things using the least amount of grease and oil and mechanical things possible.
I think cattle are the perfect equipment. You got a harvester in front and a fertilizer spreader in the back.
Yep.
And John David, your internet kind of cut out. I didn't quite catch your question.
Oh, what I was saying is kind of the economics between, grazing the oats versus baling the oats, versus put them in the solid stand versus introducing them to already established pastures. Kind of, which one is the best scenario for which farmer. And he was right. He every farm is different, and you're going to have to pick that one that fits your scenario.
I think Alan answered that perfectly. I don't think I can think of anything else to add to it. Other than, quality wise, you're never going to get as high quality as it is standing in the field. So the best you can do is just to graze it. But.
Yeah. But then maybe it's a question for Alan and Ben. How about oats for cover crop? I mean, and once we get really cold temperatures and around first couple weeks of December, the oats is going to die. So, what could that work if you're trying to do some green manure cover crop, or even some instances where people are going to go in and no-till beans or corn, or adding that into your rotation instead of baling that up, just putting that organic matter back into the ground?
That's a fantastic question, and it opens up a conversation we could have until noon, especially here in Northwest Ohio, because we have this little body of water just north of us. My farm sits about 5 miles from Lake Erie. And if you guys have paid attention at all to the news on water quality and all of that for the last 10 years with the algae blooms in Lake Erie, cover crops have become absolutely huge. Incentives through NRCS and EQIP and even local soil and water programs all over Northwest Ohio to utilize more cover crops to help clean up our lake. And actually, once I moved home from Fairfield County back in 2007, we had kind of a lull in all of my research and everything on this. And guys were still doing it around Ohio, but we just weren't looking into it quite as much. Then all of a sudden, the algae bloom problem crops up, and we're looking at cover crops. And so I started my research all up again and thought, man, if we can find a way to utilize these, even though they winter kill, and the point on that to think about, we have looked at it, not intensively in a research setting, but we have looked at what does it actually take to shut these oats down. And we've monitored growth in some of those research plots, and we've come up with about 28 degrees for a period of at least 3 to 6 hours overnight before we are going to completely stop those oats from growing. There was one year in Fairfield County that we were measuring active growth up until the 22nd of December on those oats. We do have some potential even for late season planting, again, depending on your scenario of whether you can harvest it or whether you can graze it, because once we get past about September 15th or 20th, we're not very likely to be able to plant that and have enough of a forage stand to harvest it and make it worth our time with all those equipment passes. But we definitely can get out there and graze it. And if we can utilize it in part of a management intensive grazing system that takes into part crop residues off of, say, our cornfield, stockpiled fescue, grazing these for just a short period of time in September or October, and then letting them regenerate, then we do have that cover crop on that field for the rest of the season. That even though it's going to winter kill, we've still got that foliage there. We've got that root system that's going to make a tremendously healthier soil coming into next spring. And in our cases here, which opens up the rest of that conversation, we're typically coming back onto that field with either a soybean or a corn crop the next spring. And that has changed our fertilization program a little bit. We have found out through research that somewhere in that 40 to 50 units of nitrogen is ideal in terms of an economic and benefit for maximizing tonnage and cost. But rather than using just urea or liquid 28 or straight sources of nitrogen, we've gone to utilizing ammonium sulfate to fertilize these oats. And if anybody has done any, paid any attention to research on legumes lately, that benefit of the sulfur on next year's soybean crop. We have not taken the time to measure that and put it into a real research project yet, but I can tell you from growers doing side-by-sides with urea versus ammonium sulfate, those soybean crops are not only benefiting from the soil health, but from that sulfur in that ammonium sulfate as well.
Yeah, there's less acid rain now, so there are a lot of legumes are starting to see symptoms of sulfur deficiency. Alfalfa, I know Mark Schultz has done some work with that. But and oats, I mean, I agree with Al on all those. The only thing I would like to see, you know, if you can put oats in, put it in with a mixture with other grasses. The one downside to that winter kill, you still get good cover and weed suppression from that, but having an active root system on there in the spring does help out with nitrogen capture. I think, like Alan said, we can sit and talk about cover crops for hours. But I think having an active root system like you would from like a wheat or a rye, when you starting to get warmer days before you actually get the crop out of there, they're actually going to take some of that nitrogen that's being mineralized and released from the soil. So, you know, with cover crops, I always kind of preach diversity. I mean, I think rather than having just one species, your best bet to have several different, I would say at least one, preferably two of each of the three main types, you know, having legume or grass, you know, type of brassica, try to have at least one, preferably at least two of each of those types, just because, you know, the diversity, one's going to die off, one's going to kind of grow a bit more. And, you know, if you have a dry year, one may not germinate, it just builds buffered into the system. But I think we probably get more of a fertility response, I think, from the grasses, from that nitrogen capture than we do, and plus the organic matter, everything else than we do just from having the legumes in there. So I think having another one with that will definitely be beneficial.
And I know it's a little easier too to find those mixes I know in the South anyway, and you know, we don't utilize them up here as much as we probably should, but you know, back home, you know, when I was growing up, we would buy the oats and rye and wheat mix by the gravity flow wagon, you know, full, you know, to put the cover crops on in the fall. And it was always a lot cheaper and a lot easier to find those mixes than it was those pure seed mixes, or you know, not mixes, but
Alan has as far as have you guys tried anything else besides oats for your research, you know, planting there? And from what I was reading, you plant about first couple weeks of August. Have you tried planting wheat or rye or barley or triticale and any of those plots?
We absolutely have. In fact, summer of 2019, and you guys may have been in the same boat with some of this, but we had one of the wettest springs in history, and almost 50% of the ground in Northwest Ohio went unplanted, and guys claimed prevented plant insurance that year. So just like back in my days of Fairfield County, when we were faced with an in-season emergency, we reacted as extension educators. And when USDA came out and said, we can utilize that prevented plant ground to harvest stuff after September 1st to combat the forage and feed situation that we were facing. We just took the old farmer approach again, and we went in and said, what's in the back of the shop at the research station with a partial bag of this and a partial bag of that? Let's put it in the ground and see if we can make a forage out of it. So we've done, and now we've been trying to repeat that annually just to continually look at. So we've used corn, soybeans, all kinds of different sorghum and Sudan grass mixes, pearl millet, teff grass, oats, wheat, triticale, rye, you name of it, you think of it, peas, we've tried to grow it. Some of it with some success, others not quite as much, but in that emergency situation, certainly any of those can make feed on any given year. Just depends on what's available to you, what you have the equipment to plant it with, and again, back to how can you harvest it on your operation. I've got some data on that if you want me to do any screen share and show you kind of some of what we've found on some of those other species.
Yeah, interesting. Alan, if you guys ever tried to plant corn, field corn, that in August, you get much enough growth that to make it worthwhile?
We have, and you're not obviously going to see 25-ton silage fields like we can get with that May and June planted corn, but we have had significant tonnage in terms of what we could have gotten. I'm trying to pull that file up so I can read you some of the actual numbers here as we talk. So back in 2019, we planted corn on July 2nd, and then we did another planting on July 29th, and we harvested both of those at 60 days. The yield on the earlier planted stuff was 3.5 tons of dry matter per acre, and the yield on the later planted stuff was only about half of that at 1.7 tons. But the protein was nearly double in the later planted stuff, 10.5% protein versus only 5% protein on the early July planted corn. So, got some tonnage there. And on our normal year, our oat crops, we tell guys to expect a yield of somewhere around 1 to 1.5 tons of dry matter. So we darn near doubled that with our earlier planted corn. But again, that comes back to, if we can't graze it, do we have the right equipment to properly harvest that and make the right type of feed stuff out of it? Because if we don't, then we're just wasting our time and our energy on that soil.
Yeah, Ben, we wanted Ben on the program about a month ago when we were really a lot of people were doing some either reseeding pasture fields or reseeding some hay fields. This late into the season, Ben, can say if you're even taking crops off, or can you make a seeding? And what, as far as for what would be a good grass and legume mix for, say, a good hay seeding?
Sorry, JJ, you cut out. I got about half of that.
Oh, first part of the question, is it too late into the season here to make a seeding either for pasture or hay fields? And for a hay field, what would be a good recommended mix of grasses and legumes?
We're getting right on the cusp of being too late. It really kind of depends on how, some years I've seen it and you could probably get by October 1st, some years, more years, probably not. The reason is because most time you probably need a good, especially for legumes, probably a good 6 weeks to get established before a good killing frost. I know here in Mason County, we usually get our good right about a little bit before Halloween, so we usually want to get it. So you're about 4 weeks away. It's getting a little bit close. Now I know, ideally it would have been about a month ago, like JJ said. Usually by the middle of September is usually what I kind of recommend. You can go up in about anywhere from about middle of August, mid-September, first December is usually kind of that sweet spot. But you can do it in the spring. The downside to that is, especially if you're doing a grass, you're not going to get the yield, and you may have a little bit delay on the cutting of that, and you got to manage manage for that seedling to make sure it does get established. As for, and I would say now, if you are considering seeding, now's a good time to start planning. Figure out what you want, what to do that, and take care of their fertility. I think putting lime on now, definitely by next fall, if you're going to do a fall seeding, you'd be better off to go ahead and kind of plan for the fertility. In a lot of these cases, I think a lot of the fields, a little bit of fertility, maybe a spring setting legumes, a little bit of management can go a long way. You might not actually need a full seeding. And weed control. So I think now, since it's a little bit too late to actually plant, now's a good time to really start planting. As for what, I'll go with the Rayburn mixture. I know Ed Rayburn, we always hear, you know, not ryegrass, fescue, a novel endophyte or a friendly endophyte fescue, 12 pounds of that, 3 pounds of Kentucky bluegrass, 6 pounds of red clover, and 2 pounds of white clover. I think that's a pretty good mixture. Now, there's a lot of other things you can do that. I like to have orchard grass, and I think orchard grass is you know, one of the premier species around here. Ryegrass is definitely perennial or annual. Perennial, I think, annual is a lot more popular. But those are for the perennials. Now, a lot of times, I think it's a good idea to put a companion crop in, especially if you're doing a spring seeding. What that is just an annual. You want to cut back to rate. You wouldn't do. I would probably only do maybe about a bushel, half to 3/4 of a bushel to a bushel and a half. You can kind of mix that in, and what that does is because if you're doing a spring seeding, it helps kind of buffer to get a little bit more yield from that annual crop, and compared to, you know, just the perennials themselves. So. But, you know, I think, you know, traditionally, I think fall is probably your best idea for a hayfield because those plants have enough time to get established. They go through a winter process, which they need to be able to produce through seed heads and grasses the following year, and you're not losing a cutting. Now, in the spring, you know, depending on what's there and what the operation is, you may be shy on that first cutting.
How important is it, Ben, to get some, you know, fresh seed out in these pastures? You know, we get the grass established, then we just run cattle and run cattle and run cattle. You know, how important and how often should we be looking at reseeding some of these pastures?
That's an interesting, really good question, because I think a lot of cases where something just simple as changing the management, there's a lot of seed in that soil bank. And a lot of times just changing the management, allowing the ground to recover a little bit, actually doesn't take a whole lot of new reseeding. You may have to go introduce some legumes, but even there's a lot of cases with those, people have had just beautiful big plants of white clover and never actually seeded anything. I think one thing to think about in terms of pasture specifically, if you have a lot of weeds and not a lot of pasture, weeds tend to be a symptom, not the disease. So a lot of times if you're seeing a lot of weeds, what led you to that? And, you know, until you figure that out, there's really no point in going in and putting something else in and still having that same issue year after year after year. Grazing management's a big one, rotational grazing, splitting up those pastures. You know, we have a rotational grazing, but a lot of times it's a low intensity or a gate grazing. Sometimes the gate's open. We have 2 pastures and a gate in between. Sometimes it's open, sometimes it's closed. But splitting those up, trying to increase that stocking density and move more frequently, so those forages actually, you know, they have plenty of time to recover. You know, I would say most time, and I would say on average probably about 3 to 4 weeks recovery, but it depends on the time of year too. Now, I mean, think about how you mow your grass. In the spring of the year, we have to mow the grass every week and sometimes twice a week because it's more actively growing. In that case, is in the pasture, you can get by probably less recovery as long as you don't graze it down to the ground. You leave enough leaf area so it can refeed itself. You look at the fall of the year, slows down. We don't have much. You may be looking at 6 to 8 weeks sometimes, depending on how dry it is. I mean, I think, but, you know, to get to that, I don't think necessarily establishment is probably, in some cases we do. in some cases we can benefit from establishment. A lot of times I think we need to think about changing why we got in that and how we
You
got
hit the
that
nail on the
situation.
head there. I mean, because that's the question I get all the time, and I start to think, well, what's wrong? What's the issue? Why are you having these problems? And usually it goes back to management, because a lot of times we're our own worst nightmare. We overgraze, we do consistently something wrong, and I think that you led that in a perfect direction. We really need to look at these management practices we're doing in this.
And I'll throw out there to anybody listening to, I know it sounds intimidating when people think of changing the grazing management. They think of, oh, I got to put all these crop fences and waterers and everything else. Start small. If you have a good watering area, split that pasture up a little bit. Play with that poly wire. Kind of get used to it. See if you see a benefit. I guarantee you will. But start small and work your way up. It's human nature to think when we make a change, we got to go full bore 180. No, let's just try to work our way up to that. You'll eventually see it.
Yeah, maybe a question for Ben and Alan. What about these? Reason I'm asking, I was talking to a couple people that grow a lot of custom, that bale and then sell their hay, and either in their red clover or their alfalfa instead of orchard grass, or they've been mixing some orchard grass, but they've actually been putting a lot of these novel endophyte, like the Max Q or Bar Optima, they've been actually putting that in their hay seedings. What do you guys think of that? Will that work? Good idea.
I think it's good. So for those who don't know what endophytes are, so there's a fungus, an internal fungus, Kentucky 31 tall fescue predominantly, that produces ergot-alkaloids, which are toxin, leads fescue toxicosis. Now, if you're renovating the field and you're going through, they do have what they call friendly endophytes. So what it is, if you take the endophyte out of fescue, it becomes more or less orchard grass. It's not as tolerant to more frequent cuttings, more frequent grazings. The endophyte, even though it produces toxins, it gives it a lot of other additional traits to make it more tolerant to low fertility and low intensity management. These new novel endophytes or friendly endophytes are basically the same thing, but they take the ergot-alkaloids out. So you're getting that same level of persistence over time. Now, I would say you can't graze them or cut them like you can Kentucky 31. You still need to use good, solid management. Don't take them too low. But I think they can be good. Compared to orchard grass, quality and yield-wise, I think they're pretty comparable. You do have some new finer leaf textured ones compared to the orchard grass. When sometimes you get those real thick stems on those orchard grass, they probably may be a little bit higher in quality. I haven't seen any good solid research on that, but I would say they're pretty comparable. A lot of times it comes down to what's the seed cost, and they can be a little bit more expensive than the orchard grass. So I don't know what Alan's thoughts are, so I'll let him take a crack at it.
Very, very similar. But in this part of the world up here, there's not very many guys utilizing those fescues at all. We see more of the orchard and Timothy mix in our alfalfa fields, and we are in the middle of intense alfalfa production ground here. My home county of Ottawa, just north of where I work, is extremely heavy lake bed clay soils, and we grow more wheat here than anywhere else per capita in the state, and we also grow more alfalfa here in the county because of our soil types. And because we have heavily compacted and often wet soils, the Timothy tends to do a little bit better and survives the life of that alfalfa stand versus the orchard and the fescue, which won't take that wetness near as much. So not as much experience with it, but I do agree with everything that Ben said on that topic, on those thoughts with the endophytes and making that right mix. It definitely can be used, still takes good management to get the life of that stand to last with that proper mix. Because what we typically see here is one species or the other is going to die off before we're ready to be done with that field.
Yep. A lot of times fescue, I wasn't thinking about being further north, but usually the further south, you see more of that kind of a trade-off to more fescue dominant areas. We call it the fescue belt, kind of like from northern West Virginia over to Kentucky and Missouri a little bit, and kind of southern Indiana up down through probably North Georgia, Tennessee, Arkansas. That's kind of the sweet spot for fescue. When you go further north, you definitely have a lot more of an advantage for like a Timothy, orchard grass, like Alan said.
JD, you did a bunch of research on these novel endophytes. What's your opinion?
I like the novel endophytes. Obviously they're better than the Kentucky 31, toxic endophyte. They're not going to knock your cattle off as hard. Prolactin levels are going to be higher, temperature is going to be a little lower on those, and your cattle are just going to do better. And with the endophyte in them, you're going to have that persistence, that they kind of alluded to there in that grass. Because if you remove that endophyte, you pretty much got endophyte free. Tall fescue is just not going to be as persistent as that fescue with the endophyte in it. So, I mean, we've done also hay trials. Now, hay trials, statistically, there wasn't much difference in the yields in Mason County where I hit that the tall fescue trial where I established that. So for a hay field, it doesn't really matter, and the way you store your hay too, you can have an effect on that endophyte and bringing that endophyte, kind of killing the endophyte off and preventing those ergot alkaloids, persistence in that. But, I wouldn't bank on that. So you're a little bit safer with that novel endophyte.
With storage issues, you also lose quality of the seed too.
Yeah.
Now, in a pasture situation, I don't think Kentucky 31 is so embedded. I mean, basically, if you see fescue and you didn't plant something, it's probably a 95% chance it's going to be Kentucky 31.
We just have to manage for it up here, and you can manage, for it.
And I think, a lot of times especially we're, kind of on the northern end of that, in West Virginia, northern end of that fescue belt, we don't really see the symptoms, mainly because we have a good mixture a lot of times, even if it's just weed and clover. But, management for fescue toxicosis comes down to you're getting rid of the alkaloids or diluting the alkaloids. And a lot of times we have enough in that pasture. I mean, even it's going to be really hard to eradicate Kentucky 31. And there's just so much in the seed bank's been there for years. And honestly, it's not a bad grass to have if you manage it. I think you dilute it, you keep the seed heads, because those ergot alkaloids are actually concentrated in those seed heads. When I was at Kentucky, we did a research trial, and these were stockers. So, older cattle kind of learn to stay away from them. But we had about a 2-week period where they went through and just selectively grazed just nothing but tall fescue seed heads. It was about 10 days. They went from about 2% consumption to about 85%. If you look at the ergot alkaloids in there, that was when they peaked. So they're peaking them, they're eating them for the grain quality side of it. And that's when they got a huge dose of ergot alkaloids. Now, older animals learn to get away from that. They eventually learn grazing behavior not to graze those because they are toxic or have those alkaloids in them. And the biggest issue with these novel endophytes, even novel or endophyte free, is that people think they can graze them like or Kentucky 31. They're low. They're not as Kentucky 31 is not as palatable because of those. So when you switch to a novel endophyte, you're going to get more consumption. You're going to potentially get overgrazing. So you want to make sure you don't take them below that 3 inches and rotationally graze it. Why Kentucky 31 is so persistent in continuous grazing is because of the palatability. When you do anything to improve that palatability, you also have to change the management. And that was always the big knock against, well, these novel endophytes aren't as persistent. It really comes down to just a management change. People think they can use it and abuse it like they could Kentucky 31.
Okay, we're getting go ahead, JD.
I think the further south you go to, the hotter the climate, you run into more problems. The good thing about your West Virginia, is cooler. We've been putting orchard grass. We have bluegrass. You don't have bluegrass really down south. And on those hot summer, getting into late spring and early fall there in the south, where I done my research was definitely down in Mississippi, and it was hot pretty much all year long. And it just knocked those cattle off. And we kind of set it up where we had solid stands. So, you're not going to have these solid stands up here in West Virginia. You're going to have a mix. You're going to have cooler temperatures. So, I mean, it's not as critical, I think, in West Virginia, because we do a good job, naturally with the management, with other species.
Alan, I think we're to the part of the program. My dad always told me there's two types of music, country and Western. So who's your favorite country artist?
Oh, for a long time, and of course they're not really on the scene anymore, but through high school and college, I was a big Sawyer Brown fan.
Oh, okay. First big vote for Sawyer Brown. What let's see, I'm trying to think of what the was it Boys Like Me? Was that the name of that song? They're one of
Boys
the
and
first
Me,
big
yeah.
hits. And
The Boys and Me,
the one
yeah.
about the truck driving song. 6 Days on the Road.
Yep.
Sawyer Brown. That's pretty. Ben, who's your favorite country artist?
Do I have to pick one? That's what I knew this question was coming.
We'll let you pick two if you want.
I'll pick it by errors. I'll say the Hag, Waylon Jennings,
Hey,
Keith Whitley, and then I would say just about anybody in the early mid 90s.
Keith Whitley. Let's first vote for Keith Whitley. All right. Well, we always have to get that into the program. Real quick, I want to just announce who we have coming up next on the program. We do have a switch. Friday, October 8th, we're going to move our direct marketing farm products with Lisa Jones. She's the program coordinator for the WVU Small Farm Center. And then October 15th, we're going with agritourism in West Virginia with Dee Sing Knights. She's our agribusiness economics specialist. October 22nd, we have Brad Burgeford from OSU Horticulture and Lewis Jett about growing specialty crops. And then Friday, October 29th, Brandy Brabham, Emily Morrow, and Stacy Huffman are going to be talking about women in agriculture. So that's going to be coming up on the program. We just want to remind everyone that programs and activities for WVU Extension are available to all persons without regard to race, color, sex, disability, religion, age, veteran status, political belief, sexual orientation, national origin, marital, or family status. So, and we want to thank our special guests, Alan Galler from Ohio State and Ben from here for WVU. Thank you guys for coming on the program.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Ryan.
guys.
Hey, JJ,
Yes.
we do have a guest. I'm not sure if it shows up as Gardner on my screen. Do they have any questions or comments?
Oh, okay.
Well, I'm sure they've been hanging around here. It's good.
Do you have any questions, Evan?
I've learned more today than I learn something new every day with this program. So now to get it all.
Good. Well, Alan, good luck with do you have a research plot out this year for your oats?
We do. In fact, we were set to harvest the first batch at 9 o'clock this morning. We got to the farm and we did not have the growth we expected over the last 2 weeks since we checked it last. And so we're going to let it go another week. So.
Okay. All right. Now, do you guys, are you going to bale that up or make silage bales? How do you usually harvest that?
It's hand harvest with the good old 2 foot square. And then we take it to the greenhouse and lay it out on racks to dry it with the good old fashioned air and sun drying machine.
Okay. All right.
We don't have any forage equipment at that branch. So that's all we do is pull hand harvest, calculate tonnage based on those weights, and then we'll send them off for forage sample.
Ben, you have any other wisdom to give us before we take off?
No, I can't think of anything.
Oh, well, Ben, he's a Waylon Jennings fan, so he's number one in my book. JD, you want to sign us off?
Yeah, well, thank y'all for coming and listening in and tuning in to the Mountaineer Farm Talk, the voice of West Virginia agriculture. Until next time, we'll see you around the ridge.
Okay, thank you, everyone.